Well, it may seem a strange way to begin today's sermon, but I'm going to talk about Isabel Stewart Gardner. Isabel Stewart Gardner, of course, was a New Yorker who married into a great Boston family of great wealth and collected magnificent art through her lifetime and built a beautiful house that she intended to become the museum that it is today, filled with great works of art. Also, it offers wonderful cultural exhibits and music. It's a real center and part of Boston's cultural scene. And you should probably, full disclosure, know that she is one of the people I've always been fascinated by and read up about, and there's a wonderful new biography of her. And in reading that biography, I discovered that because she was, among her many attributes, a great Episcopalian, she built Church of the Advent on Beacon Hill, a very high church, and also built and helped establish an Anglican, an Episcopal monastery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's still there today, the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And in reading the biography, I found out that she had stipulated in her will that because of her generosity to the Episcopal Church, she asked that each year after her death, on the anniversary of her birth, a priest would come from the Society of St. John the Evangelist, and Isabel Stewart Gardner had a private chapel in the house that is still there today. And she asked that the priest come and say Mass on the anniversary of her birthday each year. So I thought, So I wrote the Society of St. John the Evangelist and said, how do you get in to see this, to be part of this service? And they wrote back and said, you're invited. So in April 14th actually, I'll be going up, and in what will be, I think, a high point of my life, I'll be there for this commemoration of Isabel Stewart Gardner. It'll probably fill the ranks of the Mouse for weeks to come after that. So stay tuned. But I want to tell another story about Isabel Stewart Gardner that has more to do with seeing, which is, of course, the great theme of today's readings. Isabel Stewart Gardner was very eccentric, a real character, and very self-assured, and had enough money to back up that attitude. And she was, in building her house, she was fanatical about not letting Boston society see what the interior of the house looked like until she had her opening party. She was adamant that she would wow all of Boston society with the beauty of her new house, but no one would have a sneak peek. But the architect of the building came to her and said, Mrs. Gardner, there's a problem. In your great concert hall that you've included in the house, we cannot test the acoustics until there's an audience there, because that will change the acoustics during concerts. So we have to have people in the concert hall to test it. And she said, let me think about this. So she came back to the architect and said, I have a solution. It's imperative that no one sees the interior of the house until my opening party. So I've invited the students from the Perkins School of the Blind to come for a concert with the same fine musicians I'm going to have at the opening, but thereby preserving my great secret of how the building looks. That may seem a bit harsh, but I like that story. And to me, it speaks about the idea of course, seeing or not seeing. The great theme of what it means to be blind and what it means to see, both in the Jewish Testament and in the Gospel story. Again, a little context for John, remembering that he's the last Gospel writer, that by the time John writes, there's great conflict between the followers of Jesus and traditional Judaism. And John always points to this conflict. So again, today in the Gospel, we have several things that are somewhat problematic in the way that John presents the gospel. First of all, John doesn't really know that much about Judaism, and he makes mistakes. Now, you would take from the reading of this gospel the fact that Jewish people in the first century of the Common Era would do nothing to violate the Sabbath. But from time immemorial, the Sabbath has always been allowed to be broken if someone's life depends upon it or their well-being. So there was not a moral scripture that said, you must not do this. But John plays it up in the persons of the Pharisees as a reason for being in conflict with Jesus. Also, the idea that the Jews were somehow not embracing Jesus as the Messiah, John puts them in this story as being blind and not having seen and recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Those perhaps motivations in John's gospel are there, but they may not resonate with us in this modern day. And if they don't, then what can we learn from this gospel? Well, for me, it's the great theme, of course, of how we see and what we don't see. And that should reflect the way God sees things, how God would see us and have the world be. And there are things that get in the way of being able to see things clearly. First of all, there's the very practical, down-to-earth, literally down-to-earth way in which Jesus heals the man born blind from birth. He reaches down and picks up dirt, spits on it, rubs it in his palm, and puts it on the man's eyes. That seems pretty graphic, and it is. It's very literally earthy, linked to the most common grounding around us. Nothing fancy, no healing that occurs in the temple or the synagogue, no mention of great faith, simple, literally down-to-earth, basic, almost graphic healing that Jesus does. And then, on top of that, there then is this long discourse between the Pharisees, Jesus, the man born blind, and his parents, trying to figure out what's happening here and who Jesus is. And so there's this long debate that goes on. And part of that debate can resonate for us in questions we ask as a community of faith about theology and the nature of God. So very often I've heard people say, and wondered myself, why does illness or bad things happen to people who have strong faith, lead very good lives? Why are they hurt or fallen by terrible events or illness? And that's a question that's here. So the community of faith of this story asks the question, well, whose fault is this man's blindness? Who sinned? Was it his parents or the man born blind at birth? And Jesus says, neither. Neither were at sin. Neither had committed sins. That's not what we're talking about here. Instead, what we're talking about is revealing God. Now, many people of faith believe the place where God is most fully revealed is in the community of faith. In the things we do, the things we proclaim, the things we believe that is the center and the grounding of who God is. But that is a way of seeing God that may not be fully acceptable. This story talks about what happens when institutions or communities of faith see themselves as the holders of grace, as the institution is the thing that's important. It's the divine thing. But in this story, we're reminded that God is much greater even than communities of faith. And God would have us look more closely into the world, beyond the community of faith, out into the world to see God. And we're told that that's the way that God sees things. Again, the Pharisees are bound by their understanding of the law and its practice in the community of faith. And they can't get past that. They can't get past that this man, Jesus, is a threat and is a threat to the institution. And therefore, what he's teaching and what he's showing and doing must somehow be sinful. But of course, for us as followers of Jesus, we see this in a wholly different perspective. But we too are prey to the human inclination to see the institution as being the vessel of grace. And that's not to say that sometimes it isn't that. I've experienced in my year and a half with you all grace upon grace here in this community of faith. But I also know that God is greater than who we are. God's power, God's way of seeing is beyond our comprehension. And yet we're challenged to see the world as God would see it. And it comes down to something very simple. I love the phrase when they say, "So what happened to you?" You know, the Pharisees say, "So what's going on here?" And the man who is healed says, "I don't know. I'm blind. Now I see." That's what it's about. It's not about theology. It's not about philosophy. It's not about worship. It's not about the institution. This man changed my life. And I think the message there is to ask ourselves, are there ways that we can see more deeply? That we can approach darkness or the lack of sight and not be afraid to try to see more clearly. You know, a long time ago now, Tim and I were on a trip up to Vermont, and we stopped up in Columbia. I think it's Columbia County, maybe Greene County. It's across the river, so it's probably Greene County. We stopped at the Bronk house over across the river, which was a very old, 300-year-old farm that the Bronx, whose namesake is the Bronx, had this farm upstate New York. And Tim is usually fairly impatient with tours of old houses, whereas I love them. And we were the only people on the tour of the house. And so I was savoring how much information we were getting from the tour guide, who was sort of waxing historic in terms of what she was saying. And we were in one of the lofts of the house, and she said, you know, one of the things that's very interesting is how different our modern era is to the time that this house was built. And perhaps one of the greatest changes is the amount of light in interior buildings, in the interiors of buildings. And that literally when night came, when darkness came 300 years ago, everything changed. There was not bright interior illumination. And she said if you were sitting in a room lit by candlelight, you no longer could do what we do as modern people, which is judging how people look, their expressions. You had to actually listen very carefully to hear what they were saying or what was behind what they were saying. And I love that because the invitation to look, to hear, to engage on a deeper level is exactly what the invitation is in this gospel. And that's our work as the people of faith. We may think the work is sustaining the institution and the community of faith, and we are called to be good custodians or stewards of the institution. But it's not the central thing, and we can't lose sight of that, if you will. And in the Jewish reading, the Jewish Testament reading, we have exactly a reminder of what it is all about. What this invitation to know God more deeply by seeing the world more clearly is all about. And in the writer of Samuel, we have this story. By the way, it's an interesting story because Samuel expects to see a king among Jesse's sons. So he thinks, the tall, really good-looking guy here, he must be the king. Nope. And it goes through all the sons. And finally, Samuel says, the Lord has told me, it's none of these, and I know it's going to be one of your sons. Are these all your sons? And Jesse says, oh yeah, there's David. He's out tending the sheep. He's just a boy. He can't be who you're looking to see. And Samuel goes out and realizes it's David that God has chosen. The invitation and the reminder to go more deeply, to see more clearly, to be open to the world around us. So in that reading, we have a thing that I think says it all. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And I think the invitation there and the call is for us to look with our hearts. When we see people in need, people whose lives are vulnerable, who need our help, we're to see them not just with our eyes, but with our hearts as well. Amen.